Chapter 1. The Alien Farmer. The sun was setting over the vast expanse of tomato fields, casting a warm golden hue across the land. The air was filled with the scent of ripe tomatoes, their rich, earthy aroma mingling with the fresh evening breeze. At the edge of the field, an old farmer named Mr. Vin knelt down, carefully inspecting the plump red fruit. His hands, weathered and calloused from years of toil, moved with practiced precision as he picked the tomatoes and placed them into a wicker basket beside him. Mr. Vin had been a farmer all his life, just as his father and grandfather before him. The fields were his world, his livelihood, and his solace. But lately, something had changed. The tomatoes were growing faster, ripening earlier, and their quality was unlike anything he had ever seen. They were larger, juicier, and more vibrant in color. His neighbors had started to notice too, asking him what his secret was. But the truth was, Mr. Vin had no idea what was happening to his crops. As he continued his work, something caught his eye. A strange figure was moving through the rows of tomato plants. At first, he thought it was one of his neighbors, perhaps coming to ask for advice or to borrow something. But as the figure drew closer, Mr. Vin's heart began to race. This was no ordinary person. The figure was tall and slender, with skin that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. Its eyes were large and glowing, almost as if they were lit from within. It moved with a grace and fluidity that was almost otherworldly. Mr. Vin felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to run, to get away, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. The figure stopped a few feet away from him, its glowing eyes fixed on the basket of tomatoes. Slowly it crouched down, its long, slender fingers reaching out to gently touch one of the tomatoes. Mr. Vin watched in stunned silence as the figure examined the fruit, its expression, if it could be called that, one of intense focus. Finally, the figure looked up at Mr. Vin and spoke, its voice a soft, melodic hum that seemed to resonate in the air. "These are good," it said, its words simple yet filled with an odd sense of satisfaction. Mr. Vin blinked, his mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying him, before standing up and gesturing toward the field. "Your crops are thriving," it continued, its tone now more inquisitive. "Do you not wonder why?" Mr. Vin finally found his voice, though it was shaky and uncertain. I don't know," he stammered. "I just thought it was luck." The figure shook its head slowly. "It is not luck," it said. "It is us." Before Mr. Vin could ask what it meant, the figure turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the rows of tomato plants as quickly as it had appeared. Mr. Vin stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest, before finally gathering the courage to follow. As he made his way through the field, the sun dipped below the horizon, and darkness began to creep in. The only light came from the soft glow of the figure ahead of him. Mr. Vin followed it to the center of the field, where a strange, circular patch of land lay barren, devoid of any plants. The figure stood in the middle of the patch, its glowing eyes fixed on the sky. "This is where it all began," it said, its voice now tinged with something that sounded almost like sorrow. "We came here to help, to share our knowledge, but we did not anticipate the consequences." Mr. Vin's mind was racing. He had heard stories of strange happenings in the countryside, of mysterious lights in the sky and odd occurrences in the fields. But he had always dismissed them as old wives' tales, the kind of stories people told to scare children. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of his own field, talking to a being that was clearly not of this world. "What are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure turned to face him, its glowing eyes dimming slightly. "We are travelers," it said. "We came from a distant place, seeking to learn and to help. But we did not anticipate how our presence would affect your world." Mr. Vin felt a pang of fear mixed with curiosity. "Affect how?" he asked. The figure gestured to the barren patch of land. "This is where our ship landed," it explained. "The energy from our arrival disrupted the natural balance of your crops. It made them grow faster, stronger, but it also left scars on the land." Mr. Vin looked around at the surrounding field, now cast in shadows. He could see the difference, the barren patch where nothing grew, surrounded by rows of thriving, almost unnaturally perfect tomatoes. He didn't know what to say. "We did not mean to cause harm," the figure continued, its voice softening. "But now that we are here, we must make things right." Mr. Vin took a deep breath, trying to process everything he was hearing. "How?" he asked, his voice steadying. The figure looked up at the sky again, as if searching for something. "We will leave," it said, "and when we do, the balance will be restored. Your crops will return to normal, and the land will heal." Mr. Vin felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. He didn't understand everything that was happening, but he knew one thing for sure. He didn't want to lose the bountiful harvests that had saved his farm. Yet he also knew that the presence of this being, and whatever else was out there, was not something he could control. "When will you leave?" he asked. The figure turned to him, its glowing eyes dimming further. "Soon," it said. "But before we go, we need your help." Mr. Vin's heart skipped a beat. "My help?" he echoed. The figure nodded. "We need to ensure that our departure does not cause further harm. You know this land. You understand its rhythms. With your help, we can minimize the impact." Mr. Vin hesitated, but something deep inside him told him that this was the right thing to do. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. The figure extended its hand, and for the first time, Mr. Vin noticed a small, glowing device in its palm. "Take this," it said. "It will guide you. Together, we will restore the balance." With trembling hands, Mr. Vin reached out and took the device. It was warm to the touch, and as soon as it made contact with his skin, he felt a strange energy flow through him. The figure nodded, as if satisfied, and then began to fade, its form becoming more and more transparent until it vanished completely. Mr. Vin stood there in the darkness, the device glowing softly in his hand. He looked around at the field, now eerily quiet, and then back at the barren patch of land. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing: his life would never be the same again. Chapter 2: The Intruders. News of Mr. Vin's extraordinary harvest spread like wildfire. Soon, journalists and scientists flocked to his farm, eager to discover the secret behind the unusually bountiful crops. Mr. Vin, however, remained tight-lipped, careful not to reveal the true source of his success. The glowing device he had received from the alien remained hidden in a locked drawer in his farmhouse, its soft hum a constant reminder of the mysterious encounter. Despite his best efforts to keep the secret, strange occurrences began to attract attention. His crops continued to grow at an accelerated rate, and there were nights when he saw strange lights in the sky above his fields. These lights were not like the stars or the moon. They moved with purpose, zigzagging across the heavens before disappearing in a blink. One night, as Mr. Vin was preparing for bed, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find two men in dark suits standing on his porch. Their expressions were stern, and their eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, gave nothing away. "Mr. Vin?" one of them asked, his voice cool and measured. Mr. Vin nodded cautiously. "Yes, that's me." The man extended a badge. "We're from the government," he said. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about your crops." Mr. Vin's heart raced. He knew this day would come, but he wasn't prepared for it. "My crops?" he repeated, trying to sound innocent. "What about them?" The second man, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "There have been reports of unusual activity in the area," he said. "We're conducting an investigation to ensure that everything is normal." Mr. Vin swallowed hard. He knew these men were not here to chat about farming techniques. They were looking for something, and he feared they already knew too much. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just a farmer." The first man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course," he said, "we just want to make sure that you're not experiencing anything out of the ordinary." Mr. Vin could feel the tension in the air. These men were dangerous, and he needed to be careful. "No, nothing out of the ordinary," he lied. "Just a good season, that's all." The men exchanged a glance, and then the first man nodded. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Vin," he said. "We'll be in touch." With that, they turned and walked back to their car, leaving Mr. Vin standing in the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. He watched as they drove away, the taillights of their car disappearing into the night. He knew they would be back, and when they returned, they would want answers. As the days passed, Mr. Vin became increasingly paranoid. He started seeing strange vehicles parked near his property, and there were nights when he heard the unmistakable sound of helicopters hovering above his fields. The once peaceful farm had become a place of anxiety and fear. One evening, as Mr. Vin was working late in the fields, he heard a rustling sound behind him. He turned to see a group of men dressed in black, their faces obscured by masks. They moved silently like shadows, their intentions clear. Before he could react, one of the men grabbed him, pinning his arms behind his back. Another man stepped forward, holding a syringe filled with a clear liquid. "Don't struggle," the man said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "This won't hurt much." Mr. Vin tried to fight back, but the man holding him was too strong. He felt the needle pierce his skin, and then a cold sensation spread through his veins. His vision blurred, and the world around him began to fade. The last thing he saw before darkness consumed him was the glowing eyes of the alien figure, standing silently at the edge of the field, watching as the intruders took him away. Chapter 3: The Experiment. When Mr. Vin awoke, he was lying on a cold metal table, his hands and feet restrained by thick straps. The room was dimly lit, and the air was filled with the hum of machinery. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy and unresponsive. A door hissed open, and a group of men in lab coats entered the room. They were accompanied by the 2 government agents who had visited his farm. One of the agents approached the table, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Vin," the agent said, his tone calm and authoritative. "You've been very cooperative, but we need to know more about what you've been hiding." Mr. Vin's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice weak. The agent sighed as if disappointed. "We know about the alien," he said bluntly. "We've been monitoring the area for weeks. You've been in contact with them, and now we need to know everything." Mr. Vin felt a surge of panic. How did they know? And what did they want with him? "I don't know anything," he insisted, though he knew his words sounded hollow. The agent nodded to one of the scientists, who approached the table with a device that looked like a scanner. "We'll find out soon enough," the agent said. "This device will help us access your memories. It's a painless procedure, but it's better if you don't resist." Mr. Vin struggled against his restraints, but it was no use. The scientist placed the scanner against his temple, and he felt a strange tingling sensation in his head. His thoughts became jumbled, memories flashing before his eyes like a rapidly spinning slideshow. He saw the alien figure in his field, their conversations, the device they had given him. He saw the lights in the sky, the strange occurrences in his fields, and the night he had been taken. It was all laid bare before the men in the room, who watched intently as the scanner did its work. When it was over, Mr. Vin felt drained, as if his very soul had been laid bare. The agent removed the scanner and nodded to the scientists, who began taking notes. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Vin," the agent said, his tone almost mocking. "You've been very helpful." Mr. Vin closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a sense of helplessness. He knew now that he was just a pawn in a much larger game, one that he didn't understand and couldn't hope to control. As the men left the room, Mr. Vin heard the door hiss shut behind them. He was alone again, but this time there was no escape. Chapter 4: The Escape. Days turned into weeks as Mr. Vin remained confined in the underground facility. The scientists conducted endless tests, probing his mind and body for any traces of alien influence. They were relentless, their methods cold and clinical. But through it all, Mr. Vin held on to a small glimmer of hope, the glowing device he had hidden in his farmhouse. He didn't know if the device could help him now, but it was the only link he had to the alien figure and the promise they had made to restore the balance. He had to find a way to escape, to get back to his farm, and to the device. One night, as he lay on the cold metal table, a strange sound echoed through the facility. It was a low, rumbling noise that seemed to vibrate the very walls. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the machinery around him went silent. Mr. Vin strained to listen, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was happening, something that was causing a disruption in the facility. Could it be the alien? Suddenly, the door to his room hissed open, and the alien figure stepped inside. Its glowing eyes were dim, and its movements were slower than before, but it was unmistakably the same being that had visited his farm. "We must leave now," the alien said, its voice urgent. "They are coming." Mr. Vin didn't need to be told twice. The alien reached out and touched the restraints holding him down. With a soft hum, the straps released, freeing him from the table. He sat up, his body weak but determined. "Follow me," the alien said, turning and heading for the door. Mr. Vin stumbled after it, his mind racing. "How did you find me?" he asked, his voice hoarse. The alien didn't answer, instead leading him down a series of dimly lit corridors. The rumbling noise grew louder, and Mr. Vin could feel the vibrations beneath his feet. "They are coming," the alien repeated, its voice filled with a sense of urgency. Mr. Vin didn't know who they were, but he had no intention of sticking around to find out. They reached a large metal door, and the alien placed its hand against it. The door slid open, revealing a dark tunnel that stretched out into the distance. "This way," the alien said, leading him into the tunnel. As they made their way through the darkness, Mr. Vin's mind raced with questions. What had the alien done to cause the disruption? And where were they going? After what felt like an eternity, they reached the end of the tunnel where a small hatch led up to the surface. The alien gestured for Mr. Vin to climb up. "Hurry," it urged. "They are close." Mr. Vin scrambled up the ladder, his heart pounding in his chest. He pushed open the hatch and emerged into the cool night air. They were in the middle of a dense forest, far from any sign of civilization. The alien followed him up and quickly closed the hatch behind them. It then turned to Mr. Vin, its glowing eyes now dim and weary. "You must go back to your farm," the alien said. "The device you have is the key to restoring the balance. But you must act quickly." Mr. Vin nodded, though he didn't fully understand. "What about you?" he asked. The alien shook its head. "My time here is over," it said. "I have done what I can. The rest is up to you." Before Mr. Vin could ask any more questions, the alien began to fade, its form becoming more transparent until it vanished completely, leaving him alone in the dark forest. He stood there for a moment, trying to process everything that had just happened. The alien was gone, but it had given him a mission, one that he knew he had to complete. With a deep breath, Mr. Vin began the long journey back to his farm, determined to use the device to restore the balance and protect his land from those who would exploit it. Chapter 5. The Final Stand. When Mr. Vin finally reached his farm, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the fields. Everything looked so peaceful, but he knew that it wouldn't last. The government agents and scientists would be coming for him, and he needed to be ready. He rushed to his farmhouse and retrieved the glowing device from its hiding place. It pulsed softly in his hand, its energy filling him with a sense of purpose. He didn't fully understand how it worked, but he knew that it was the key to restoring the balance that the alien had spoken of. As he stepped outside, he could hear the distant sound of helicopters approaching. They were coming for him, just as the alien had warned. But he wasn't going to let them take his land, his crops, or the alien's gift without a fight. With the device in hand, Mr. Vin made his way to the barren patch of land in the center of his field, the spot where the alien ship had landed. The ground was still scarred, but he could feel a strange energy emanating from it, as if the very earth was calling out to be healed. He knelt down and placed the device on the ground. It began to hum, its glow intensifying as it resonated with the energy of the land. Mr. Vin closed his eyes and focused, trying to connect with the device to understand its purpose. Suddenly, the ground beneath him began to tremble, and the air was filled with a low, resonant hum. The device pulsed with light, sending waves of energy through the earth. The barren patch of land began to change, the scarred earth healing before his eyes as new life emerged from the soil. But the transformation was not without cost. The energy released by the device was powerful, and it was attracting attention. The sound of helicopters grew louder, and soon Mr. Vin could see them hovering above the fields, their searchlights sweeping across the land. He knew that he didn't have much time. The device was working, but it needed more energy to complete the restoration. He looked around desperately, searching for a solution. And then he remembered the alien had said that the balance could only be restored with his help. It was his connection to the land, his knowledge of its rhythms, that was needed to guide the process. Without hesitation, Mr. Vin placed his hands on the device, allowing its energy to flow through him. He could feel the pulse of the earth beneath him, the life force of the crops, the very essence of the land. He focused all his willpower on the task at hand, directing the energy of the device to heal the scars left by the alien's arrival. The ground shook violently, and the air was filled with a blinding light as the device reached its peak. Mr. Vin could feel the energy coursing through him, almost overwhelming in its intensity. But he held on, determined to see it through. Finally, with a deafening roar, the energy burst forth, spreading across the entire field. The barren land was transformed, new crops springing up in an instant, vibrant and full of life. The scars were gone, the balance restored. But the effort had taken its toll on Mr. Vin. He collapsed to the ground, exhausted, as the device's glow began to fade. The helicopters above continued to circle, but the energy release had created a powerful electromagnetic field, disrupting their systems and forcing them to retreat. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its warm light over the newly restored fields, Mr. Vin lay there, barely conscious. He had done it. He had saved his land, his crops, and the alien's gift. But at what cost? Epilogue. A new beginning. Days later, the government agents returned to Mr. Vin's farm, but they found nothing out of the ordinary. The fields were thriving, the land was healed, and the strange occurrences had ceased. Mr. Vin himself was found resting in his farmhouse, tired but at peace. The glowing device, however, was gone. Its purpose fulfilled, it had vanished, leaving no trace of its existence. The agents conducted their investigations but found nothing to explain the extraordinary events that had taken place. Mr. Vin returned to his life as a farmer, his crops now growing at a natural pace. The alien figure never appeared again, but he could still feel its presence, a silent guardian watching over the land. As the seasons passed, the farm flourished, and Mr. Vin's reputation as a master farmer grew. People came from far and wide to learn his secrets, but he kept the true story to himself, knowing that some mysteries were better left unsolved. And so life continued, the farm a beacon of hope and prosperity in the countryside. But Mr. Vin knew that the world was much larger than it seemed, and that there were forces at work beyond his understanding. He had been touched by something extraordinary, something that had changed him and his land forever. And as he worked the fields, he would sometimes glance up at the sky, wondering if the alien was still out there, watching, waiting, and ready to return when the balance was threatened once more.